Thank y'all for joining us for this webinar on navigating financial aid for immigrant families. We're joined today by the Utah Higher Education Assistance Authority and HICA, the Hispanic Interest Coalition of Alabama. Alabama Possible is doing this in partnership with our campaign called Cash for College, where we start conversations about financial aid with students all across the state of Alabama. So just a few housekeeping rules before we get started. This webinar will be recorded. It will be posted to youtube.com/alabamapossible. Throughout the webinar, you're able to submit questions through two different features in Zoom. We have the Q&A feature as well as the chat feature. And if possible, panelists will answer some of those questions in the chat feature throughout the webinar, but most likely we're going to hold all of those questions until the end of our presentations so that our panelists might answer them aloud. If for some reason you're not able to stay through the end of the webinar, again, we'll be posting a recording of that webinar to make sure that you get your question answered. All right, next we would like to ask that if you do have a webinar topic you'd like for us to cover, feel free to contact us either at cashforcollege@alabamapossible.org or call us at 205-939-1408. And you can always reach out to us on social media. It's where you'll get up-to-date news on financial aid topics as well as webinars that we'll be hosting. Our Facebook is facebook.com/cashforcollegeal, and our Twitter and Instagram are @cashforcollegeal. I'm going to stop sharing my screen really quickly. Right, thanks to all the folks who've just started joining us. So I would like to introduce our first presenter, Katie Mazzy. Katie Mazzy serves as the Manager of Outreach and Scholarships at the Utah Higher Education Assistance Authority, UHEAA, and has worked in the realm of college access for over a decade. She is a first-generation college student with bachelor's degrees in history and political science and a master's degree in public administration from the University of Utah. I'll let Katie take over now.
All right, May, thank you for that introduction. I appreciate it. And before we get started, I wanted to let all of you know I have very limited exposure to Alabama, but my one fond memory, my only exposure, is basically the best memory that you could ever ask for from childhood. Because when I was 12 years old, I wrote to my school district to apply for a grant to go to an educational summer camp. And of course I chose space camp because what kid wouldn't, given the option? And so my one and only visit to Alabama was to Huntsville to the US Space Academy, and it was awesome. So I have a soft spot for Alabama in my heart. And May has asked that I join you all today to discuss a little bit about the landscape of college access and college affordability for immigrant families. And I think it's important to get perspectives from other states because, as you know, not all of your students will stay in state to attend college. And so it's helpful to know what's going on across the nation. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. All right, so to get started, I think it's important to just set a baseline of some of the terms that we're going to be using. So when we refer to immigrant families or an immigrant individual, all that means is somebody who's residing in this country or in a country who was not originally born there. And so when we talk about an undocumented individual, by contrast, that's in reference to a person who either entered the US legally and now their immigration status has expired, or entered the US without documented authorization. When we talk about DACA, or the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals Program, or the term documented, and we're going to get into some details about this in a moment, that describes a person who's been granted protection to stay in the country under the DACA program that was passed in the Obama administration. And then we often use the phrase dreamer as well. This is a little bit more broad, and it's not a legal definition by any means. In this case, when we say dreamer, what we mean is a student who lives in this country. Typically, they have been here since childhood. This is the country that they know for all intents and purposes, but they're facing significant barriers to finding a reasonable path to citizenship or permanent residency in the country.
Katie, one moment, if you don't mind my interrupting you, could you
Yeah.
possibly make the slides full screen?
Oh yeah, sorry, it's full screen on my computer. I'm wondering.
Oh, okay.
Let's see here.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be a Zoom meeting without technical difficulties, right?
Looks like if you click in that bottom right corner, that present button right close to where your mouse was.
Yeah, it's okay. I see the problem. It is sharing it full screen on a different monitor. So let me do this. Okay, can you see it full screen now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. And I know this is super awkward, but it's also part of working from home. I'm going to open my office door so my cat stops scratching it and you don't have to hear her.
No problem at all. Couldn't even hear it.
Just part of working from home life, right? Come on in, cat. All right. So let's go ahead and advance to where we were. All right. So the important thing to remember here is anytime we're discussing these topics, and I know that everyone on this webinar cares deeply about this issue, so I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but whenever we talk about issues of immigration, it's important to remember that every student has a unique story, and to train ourselves to start to recognize and to get away from our internal biases, both maybe we know about them, maybe we don't know about them, but avoid expressing our unconscious or conscious biases through things like microaggressions, or making assumptions about a student's background, or using dehumanizing language, such as an illegal immigrant. When we look at the national landscape in terms of just access to education in general, before we even dive into the college discussion, I think it's really important to talk about the background of K-12 education for undocumented immigrant populations. So to go back to the 80s, there was a law on the books in Texas at that time, in the early 80s, that essentially said if a school district is offering education to an undocumented student, that school district is going to lose its state funding from the state of Texas. So of course, this was challenged in the courts. It made it all the way up to the US Supreme Court, which the decision was issued in 1982. And what the Supreme Court says is that this is an unconstitutional move on behalf of Texas. So what they really centered the argument around is the 14th Amendment and its equal protection clause. And what they were reading in the Constitution is that the 14th Amendment really only refers to people. It doesn't refer outright to citizens. So when Texas is essentially denying an undocumented student a K-12 education, they're putting that student at a severe disadvantage without serving a compelling state interest. So in case anyone was curious, again, as May mentioned, I was a history major, so this is part of the reason why I find this so interesting, but this is why in this country, students can get a K-12 education, even if they are an undocumented immigrant. Of course, the landscape is quite a bit different for higher education, which is why we're discussing this today. So fast forward exactly 30 years from the Plyler versus Doe case, and we get deferred action for childhood arrivals. So just a little bit of background about this program. This was an executive order under the Obama administration in 2012, and it refers to immigrant youth who came to the US as children, the dreamers that we referred to earlier. And the term youth here is a little counterintuitive. That could mean anyone from a teenager to somebody who's like in their mid-30s at this point. It offers temporary protection from deportation for somebody who is undocumented. And that means basically 2 years where you have a DACA issued social security number that allows you to stay in the country and attend school or work without the fear of deportation. And DACA had the ability built in for recipients to be able to renew every 2 years. So when it was originally passed, the requirement was that you had to be under 31 and you had to be in the country consistently when you were applying for DACA protection. In addition, you had to be either a student or a high school graduate, and you couldn't have had any felonies or significant misdemeanors on your record, such as a DUI or more than 3 insignificant misdemeanors. You also had to come to the US before the age of 16 in order to apply for DACA. So we fast forward again to 2020, and DACA is really in flux. So some of you may remember in late 2017, the Trump administration announced that they would be rescinding DACA. They would not be taking any new requests, and they would also be phasing out any current recipients who had DACA protections. That, of course, was challenged in the courts as well, and that brought us to November 2019 when the US Supreme Court heard oral arguments about DACA. And right now we still don't have an answer. So the Supreme Court is supposed to issue its decision by June, but as of today, at least, we don't have an answer. So my advice there is to just stay tuned for whatever information might be coming down the pipe. Which now brings us to the federal financial aid landscape. When we talk about federal financial aid, it's three main programs. It's the Pell Grant, Work Study, as well as federal direct student loans. And you have to complete a FAFSA in order to apply for any of those forms of aid. And when it breaks down to who qualifies, any US citizen can apply for this Title IV federal financial aid. There are some exceptions we'll see at the bottom that go beyond just immigration status. I'll talk about those in a minute, but for the most part, if you're a US citizen, you can apply. They've also carved out exceptions for eligible non-citizens, is what the FAFSA refers to. And this is somebody who has both a social security number and an alien registration number, which you would typically find on a green card. And the most common situation we see in Utah where a student is considered an eligible non-citizen is somebody who has been granted refugee status in the country. And then with a student who is undocumented or in the DACA program, they will not be eligible for any Title IV aid, which is broadly what we're going to be discussing today. Some of the other restrictions, like I mentioned, outside of immigration, you do have to have a high school diploma to get. You can't have any, so certain criminal convictions could bar you from financial aid, at least temporarily. For example, if you were convicted of drug sale or drug possession while you were receiving federal financial aid, you would be ineligible until you meet your college's criteria for regaining eligibility. The other big one that we'll talk about later on as well is satisfactory academic progress. So each college sets a threshold for academic performance, and if you fall below it, you may have your federal financial aid rescinded. Usually the threshold the college sets is a combination of how many credits are you passing versus how many credits are you actually attempting, and your GPA. So it's usually a combination of those two things. And then of course, if you are in delinquency on any previous federal student loans, you may also lose your eligibility to apply for federal financial aid. So completing the FAFSA for US citizens who have a parent or two parents who are undocumented is a question we often get. So a parent's immigration status will have absolutely no bearing whatsoever on the student's ability to qualify for federal financial aid. So if the student is a US citizen, we advise that they still should complete a FAFSA. How this works mechanically on the application is that you'll list zeros for the parent's social security number. Some folks will try to put the ITIN or individual taxpayer identification number of the parent, which can cause some problems. And just as a little bit of background on ITINs, this is also really interesting. There's approximately 4.5 million undocumented individuals in the US who still pay federal income tax using an ITIN that they've gotten from the IRS. And that equates to about $9 billion in tax revenue into the US system annually, which is one of the reasons why leaving undocumented students ineligible for financial aid is so controversial, because so many families are actually paying into the system and then are being barred from the ability to actually reap those taxpayer benefits. And if you do list zeros for a parent's social security number, the way that this kind of changes the FAFSA operationally is in two ways. One, the parent won't be able to use the IRS data retrieval tool. They'll have to enter their income and tax information manually, and they won't be able to digitally sign the FAFSA for the student. They'll have to print, sign, and mail a signature page. Sorry. All right, so a little bit of background on how Utah treats financial aid and college access. In our state, a student's immigration status has no bearing on their ability to attend or apply for admission to our schools. So whether it's a public college or university or a private college or university, an undocumented or a documented student can attend our institutions. That is not necessarily the case across the country. So the vast majority of states do allow undocumented individuals to access post-secondary education. And of course, I won't talk too much about this because we'll get into this with the second presenter, Deanna, but there are 2 states that prohibit undocumented students from being able to attend at least public institutions. In terms of financial aid, Utah's a little bit more of a mixed bag. So as we talked about, federal financial aid is off the table for undocumented students. However, we do have a bill or a law on the books that allows undocumented students to receive in-state tuition rates as long as they attend a Utah high school for at least 3 years and they graduate from a Utah high school. Aside from that, the state of Utah bars undocumented students from being able to receive taxpayer-funded aid. So any state grants or state scholarships are off the table, but we do have the stipulation that students can apply for privately funded scholarships. And this took a little bit of research. It's actually really hard to find any central location where these policies are discussed, but from what I've been able to find, this varies so drastically, the access to financial aid across the country for students. So the states in yellow are by far the most liberal with their aid. They allow undocumented students to receive both in-state tuition rates as well as state-funded financial aid. The ones in blue are a little bit more like Utah. Undocumented students can get in-state tuition, but they can't necessarily apply for financial aid that comes from the state's budget. The gray area states, all that means is it really varies by either it's left up to the institution and the actual Board of Regents or the Higher Ed Commission doesn't make the decision, or there's just no express legislation on the books that actually address it. And then the states in the black are ones that actually have laws on the book specifically prohibiting undocumented students from being able to receive any state aid or in-state tuition rates. And that brings us to, now that you understand the landscape in Utah a little bit, how does our organization support students and families and help them navigate through this process? The number one thing that we found useful is having really strong partners in the community. And I'm hoping that by sharing this information, you'll be able to identify some of the equivalent organizations in your own state that you can maybe start to partner with as well if you don't already. So the number one resource that we utilize to help undocumented students find financial aid are the Dream Centers that are set up at 2 of our 11 institutions. That's the University of Utah and Salt Lake Community College. They do a phenomenal job of connecting undocumented and documented students to all sorts of resources, but especially private scholarships in the state. The other big one that we partner with, Latinos in Action. It's a nonprofit that was started in Utah but has since expanded to a few other states. They run all kinds of programs, mentorships, scholarships. They do an elective course in schools where students can actually prepare for college readiness during the school day. So we rely really heavily on Latinos in Action, as well as a couple of other local nonprofits and state entities, including Comunidades Unidas. They do an excellent job of helping us address parental engagement specifically for undocumented individuals in the state. We also make a distinct effort to make sure that all of our Paying for College resources are translated. There's 2 big ones that we offer every year. We do a Paying for College guide that's a comprehensive overview of savings, scholarships, and federal financial aid in the FAFSA. We also do a FAFSA walkthrough kit. And so those are available in Spanish. Of course, not every immigrant family, either documented or undocumented, will speak Spanish. And so we have a very limited budget for professional translation services, but we're exploring ways to also translate these into other languages that Utah would need, including like Arabic and Portuguese, Vietnamese, and Chinese as well. And then scholarships. So we operate our own scholarship website called CompleteScholarships.org. Our focus is really state and local scholarships only because we feel that those are the contests that students stand the greatest chance of winning because they're smaller pools of applicants. So our team does the research of finding and vetting local scholarship opportunities, and we make a distinct point of saying in our information whether or not that scholarship requires U.S. citizenship or legal residence as part of its application process. And then, as I mentioned, the Dream Centers at the University of Utah and Salt Lake Community College operate a couple of websites, and they do an excellent job of finding not only state and local, but also private scholarships that do not have a U.S. citizenship requirement so that undocumented and documented students can apply for them. One potential issue that you all might have encountered, and that we certainly encounter all the time, is that if an undocumented student can't apply for the FAFSA, that's one thing. However, now a private scholarship application, so for all intents and purposes, they qualify for that money, but the application itself is asking for information from their FAFSA. What do we do in that situation? And we take a twofold approach. Our first recommendation is to have the student talk to the scholarship committee insofar as they feel comfortable. If they feel comfortable talking about their immigration status, this is one option. They can discuss with the committee if there are alternatives for demonstrating financial need, such as a tax return, paycheck stubs, whatever that might be. And we found that many scholarship committees are really flexible in working with students. If they are not willing to offer that as an option, the second choice that we have is to help a student do a paper FAFSA, which is burdensome. It's definitely a barrier in and of itself, but they can download a PDF FAFSA. We can help them fill it out by hand. And then we work with the college financial aid offices to have them perform a hand calculation of the expected family contribution, or EFC number, that the FAFSA generates. As you can imagine, hand calculating an EFC number from all the information on the FAFSA is a nightmare for everyone involved, but it is definitely an option if it comes down to that. Now, May has also asked me to talk a little bit about the landscape of financial aid in light of COVID-19. And I will preface this by saying that things are changing literally every day. So this information is up to date as of right now, but please watch the news and look for reliable resources to give you more information as things progress. First and foremost, the thing that we're seeing the most come out of our communities, we actually had a 270% increase in call volume from families in April of this year compared to April of 2019. And by far, the number one thing that they're asking about is, hey, my income has changed. My 2018 taxes that I used on the FAFSA no longer reflect my financial reality because my parent has been furloughed or their hours have been cut in half or whatever it might be. And so what we're advising students to do in that situation is to work with the financial aid office at their college or university. Each institution has a different process for working with students to document that new income reality, but usually they're really good to work with, whether it's submitting paycheck stubs or proof of layoff or unemployment benefit, something like that. They've been reasonable in working with families to kind of reassess financial need. Now, many of you, I'm sure, have heard about the CARES Act, the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act. And this is really broad. I mean, this is where we're getting all sorts of financial relief from the government for all sectors, not just higher education, but there's a lot in here that actually affects higher ed. So first and foremost, with the Pell Grant, institutions have been given more flexibility to not require a student to count this semester against their lifetime eligibility. And so let's say a student withdrew from spring semester because they couldn't handle the adaptation to the online environment when their school closed. The college can now exclude that from their lifetime eligibility for Pell Grant, which is typically about 6 years of Pell Grant usage. There's also some flexibility here with work study. So colleges are now allowed to still pay out the work study award, even if their students can't fulfill their job duties because campus is closed. So that's been a really big relief for students as well. And then, of course, this is the big one. Federal student loan repayment has been halted until September 30th of this year. And I've heard discussion that Congress is considering extending that even further. This doesn't hurt borrowers' credit at all. It still counts as an on-time payment to credit reporting agencies. And they've also essentially dropped the interest rate to 0 until September 30th. So if any federal student loan borrower does feel like they have the ability to still make payments, any money that they put toward their federal loan right now is essentially just going to the principal. So it's also something that people can take advantage of. Now, within the CARES Act, We have the Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund, or HEERF, which is the absolute worst acronym that I can ever imagine. HEERF, it's pretty terrible. But this is $14 billion that Congress allocated to give to institutions of higher ed to alleviate some of the burden that they're experiencing from COVID-19 and school closures. So when an institution applies for one of these grants, at least half of the money, or approximately half of the money, has to go directly to students. There is a lot of confusion and a lot of limitation around this, however. So the language stipulates that any grant that's made to the student has to relate directly to the disruption of a campus closure during COVID-19. So for example, we do a weekly call with all the financial aid directors in Utah about how they're using this money. And they're facing some significant barriers because they can't just say, oh, a student lost their job, so I'm going to give them an emergency grant out of this pool of money. They actually have to document that the hardship is related directly to the campus closure. So what some schools are doing is they're saying, I know that students are going to have an increase in their electricity bill. So because of, working from home or doing school from home. So I'm going to give them a grant for that. Or some schools are saying, we assume that a student is incurring charges for home internet, for example. And so we're going to help subsidize or kind of offset some of the costs of paying for internet every month. Things like that are what they're finding they have to do in order to document this appropriately. Now, the really big complication here is that when this law was originally passed, when this money was allocated, Congress didn't say anything about citizenship. And Betsy DeVos in the Department of Ed about 2.5, 3 weeks ago released guidance to colleges and universities that said in order to receive this money, a student has to be Title IV eligible. They have to be eligible to complete a FAFSA. So that's where it stands right now. Colleges aren't allowed to give any of this grant money to undocumented individuals or individuals in the DACA program. However, I read this morning that a California community college is suing the Department of Ed over that guidance. And several members of Congress are also calling out the Department of Education and saying, this runs in contempt of our decision. This is nowhere in the language, nowhere in the legislation, and it runs contrary to what this bill was intended for. So the line right now is that an undocumented student can't apply for this money or can't be awarded this money, but that could very well change in the coming days. One last issue that we've been encountering that you also might see, especially if you're working with high school age populations, is that all of the K-12 schools in Utah are closed through the end of the school year. And what happened when that decision was made is that quite a few students, especially high school seniors, decided that concurrent enrollment in an online-only environment was not for them, right? The difficulty that they might face was too great. And so a lot of these students decided that they would either withdraw from their concurrent enrollment classes or they would choose to get a pass-fail grade instead of an actual GPA-oriented grade. And as we talked about earlier, schools, colleges set their SAP, or Satisfactory Academic Progress policies, so that you have to remain above a certain academic threshold in order to continue receiving federal aid. The problem that this has caused, that we've talked quite a few students through, is that some students are worried now that they're not going to qualify for federal financial aid when they set foot on their college campus in the fall. And so the answer that we have to give students is really, it depends, because SAP policies are so different from college to college. Some of them are very lenient in their grade requirements. Some of them give the student a full year as a regularly enrolled college student before they'll even start assessing SAP, whereas some start assessing it right away. And so really the guidance we have to give is that the student should work with their financial aid and admissions office directly to talk about these concerns. The nice thing though is that we're hearing from colleges that even if a student in this situation is losing eligibility for their aid, they are being really lenient in granting appeals. So a student just has to appeal with the school and say, I withdrew as a result of a COVID-19 hardship. And for the most part, those appeals are being granted, no questions asked, essentially. So I know we don't have time to actually do this discussion in person, but I wanted to bring these up because this slide should actually be titled "The Things That Keep Me Up at Night," and I know they're probably keeping you up at night as well. And if we don't have time to discuss it here, I would love for you all to contact me, call me, email me. I would love to hear your thoughts on some of these issues. And so some of the things specifically that we worry about in our department is how to make sure that our programming is culturally relevant as we speak with families. How do we get past just the nuts and bolts of college access and financial aid and really help students see the optimism in this next step in their future? Another big one is all the time as to whether or not to make the FAFSA a high school graduation requirement. And as we can see from the information we just discussed, there's a lot of pros and cons involved in that. I also just constantly wonder about the future of federal and state access to financial aid and the future of DACA in general. And I know that y'all are dealing with these concerns as well. So anything you want to share with me, any ideas you want to bounce off of me, feel free to contact me at any point today or in the future, and I'd love to continue the discussion. So with that, I am going to turn the time back over to May, and I'll look at the chat to see if there are any questions I can start answering.
Thank you so much, Katie. And I'm going to turn my video back on. So we appreciate Katie joining us and giving us an idea of not only the national landscape, but also what's happening in Utah and what Alabama can learn from the state of Utah. So next, I will be introducing our second panelist. Deanna Martinez Garcia is a native of Mexico, but was raised from the age of 4 in Albertville, Alabama, the only home she's ever known. Growing up undocumented and graduating high school in a time before DACA came into existence, she knows firsthand what it's like to have to knock down multiple barriers in order to attain a post-secondary education. She is now the youth and education organizer at HICA, where she is in charge of all the college access and youth-related programming, and focuses on helping students in her state overcome the barriers they encounter on their path towards higher education. So I am going to share my screen with you now and pull up Deanna's slides. One moment. All right.
Sorry, I was muted. Well, thank you very much for that introduction. And yes, so thank you very much to Katie also, I think on behalf of all of us in Alabama, because there's a lot of information that we still need. And a lot of it I have been working on, collecting it. It's not the only thing I do at HICA, so sometimes my attention has to be distributed somewhere else. But that was really helpful information. A lot of it does apply to what we see in Alabama. So with that, I'm going to share some of the things that I have found in my work here in Alabama that would help us help these students. So as you all saw from Katie's presentation, there's certain states that do allow undocumented students to attend college, but some don't. And so here in Alabama, who can attend college in Alabama? Students with the authorization to be in the U.S. and that have a social security number are allowed to enroll in Alabama public colleges and universities and pay in-state tuition. I do want to make a note here, as we saw in Katie's slides. In Alabama, most public universities do allow students that have a social security number, such as documented students or students with a green card or students that have refugee status, to enroll, and some of them allow them to pay in-state tuitions and others don't. So that has been a really gray area, as we saw from the previous presentation, that we have been having to navigate here in Alabama. The university that I have like the most experience with is UAB. They do some weird thing where they enroll documented students as out of state, and then they have to apply later after their first year to receive in-state. And it's been really weird. I've been trying to get clarification. But going back to another point that Katie brought up in her presentation, it's really hard to find a centralized place for all of these rules and laws. They just seem to be very vague, and there's really you ask for the reason why things are and no one really knows where to point you to. So The majority of public institutions do allow documented students to pay in-state tuition, which is good, but some of them still make them pay out of state. So that is a thing that students, and if you're helping them out with advising them on going to universities or colleges, that would be something that you'd have to ask the institution specifically. So the next point, undocumented students without a status are not allowed to enroll in public colleges or universities. So when I say an undocumented student without a status, that would be an undocumented student who doesn't have DACA, who doesn't have any kind of protection legally. So that would be the students that are mostly graduating now that didn't qualify to apply for DACA, and then it got rescinded, so applications had to stop. So we are seeing a lot of undocumented high school seniors graduating right now without DACA and without any other kind of protection. And those students here in the state of Alabama are not allowed to enroll in public colleges. However, they can enroll in private universities at the discretion of the university's admissions office. So of course, because we know private universities have their own set of rules. They don't have to basically follow what the federal or state government says. It is at their discretion, and I'll talk a little bit more about that the next slide. So, okay, so we know from the previous presentation that undocumented students cannot receive federal aid, and they also cannot receive state aid here in the state of Alabama. So for undocumented students, including documented students who are not eligible for federal or state aid, there are a lot of public universities that have scholarships that are available for documented students. And documented students enrolling in these universities should inquire about these because they're not made public often. And I've found this out also through just communication with some of the students that I help. They will tell me about schools such as like the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa, who doesn't have anywhere on their website that they have scholarships to grant documented students, but upon like further asking and inquiring about and students like being open with their status, because that's another thing. Sometimes students are afraid to ask and are afraid to disclose that they are documented. But after like digging a little bit, I have found that students are able to get scholarships up to like $3,000. So that is something that I'm still like investigating a little bit more to pass on information to students and stuff. But yeah, so oftentimes, like I said, if you just ask, some public universities will have some kind of fund that didn't come from federal or state funds. So so for this next one, still talking about how to pay for college when undocumented. When the student is undocumented with no status and planning to attend a private institution in the state. So right now we're talking about going to school, attending school here in Alabama. Sometimes when I talk to undocumented students without a status, and I have to tell them, in the state of Alabama, you aren't allowed to enroll in a public school, and they start looking at private institutions, and they start looking at the tuition cost, and they start thinking, I can't do this. But if they should see if the private institution, they should be eligible for the financial aid that school can offer. That is, like I said, if they choose to go to school here, because another option that I have seen some students take is go to school out of state. As y'all saw on the map in Katie's presentation, there are a lot of other states where things could be a little bit better for these students, but some of them, because of not wanting to leave home, like not wanting to leave too far away from home, they will choose to stay in this school. So I often recommend going to a private institution. And there is also a large number of scholarships for undocumented students available on a national level, and a few within the state of Alabama. So HECA has a scholarship. It is a small scholarship, but we do have a scholarship that any student is eligible for. We don't check the immigration status or anything. And there are a few other organizations, usually nonprofit organizations, that have scholarships available for undocumented students without a status. But HECA has a list of scholarships for undocumented students that are on a national level, and these are good to apply to. but oftentimes students will get discouraged because they do end up having to compete, with a lot of other students in the entire country. But if anybody, and I know I sent the PDF to May, but we are trying to make that available on our website as well. And if anybody wants a copy of that or for me to send that electronically, I can definitely do that after this presentation. So college options for undocumented students without DACA. As I talked about earlier, private universities, some examples of that are Birmingham Southern College, Stanford University, Spring Hill College. So those are like top 3 that I know a lot of students will enroll at. But I will talk a little bit more about that. So each will have their own specific requirements for admissions and financial aid award processes. So yeah, everything will be at their discretion. So when students are looking to go to college and want to explore some of these options, they should definitely check with their admissions office and all of that before they decide which one would be a best fit for them. So I want to talk a little bit about Birmingham Southern College. I want to give them a shout out because of all of these colleges that I mentioned, and I do refer a lot of students to these colleges, as I spoke about earlier, since DACA is being phased out, or they are trying to phase it out, and a lot of students graduating high school right now do not have DACA. We have had to have a lot of conversations about, private universities being the best option. And I have been reaching out to them, and in those conversations, Birmingham Southern College has been like the best to respond to this. They have actually put policies in place to become a more welcoming institution for all students, regardless of documentation. And so their process is that they will review and render an admission decision to anyone who graduated from a U.S. high school, regardless of status. So yeah, like I've talked to them, and they are actively trying to accommodate the students right now that are graduating without a status. So part of this process is the student will still need a student aid report. As we talked about earlier, sometimes scholarships will want that just because it gives them the EFC or just like what that amount that their family is expected to contribute. But they have come up with an alternative to FAFSA, which is a CSS profile, instead of a FAFSA for those who cannot complete FAFSA, because we have had trouble with when a family is completely undocumented and no one in the family has a social security number. I don't know if anybody on here can correct me, but at least me helping students out, FAFSA has said, no, we can't process it, which I just found out from Katie that we can ask the school's financial aid to do it manually. I did not know that, but Birmingham Southern did come up with using the CSS profile to do the same thing. It provides the school with the same information as the FAFSA, but it's a private company that the government has no access to. So that also alleviates a little bit of that nervousness that the family might have about, providing their information to a federally owned website or entity. So if you want more information about Birmingham Southern, like I said, I'm not representing them in any way. I'm just shouting them out on here because they have been the best to respond to this need here in the state of Alabama. So if you want to contact Elena Elgin, she's the admissions counselor and international admissions counselor, and that's her. On the screen, you can see her email if you have any students, that you would want to refer here. And I think, yeah, that's the end of what I have. So I will be turning it back over to May and looking at some of these questions, see if I can answer any of them. And also real quick, I'm sorry, I'm gonna put my email on the chat so that everyone can get it if anybody wants to get a hold of me later.
Thank you so much, Deanna. We really appreciate the time you took to present for us. So we are going to wrap up right now with a little bit of Q&A. So I am going to share my screen really quickly. Let's see. One moment, bear with me. All right, so I'm going to ask for my colleague Manisha to come on the line to just facilitate our Q&A session.
Hello, everyone. This is Manisha here. I work at Alabama Possible. I have one question for Deanna. Do you know of any undocumented students to apply as an international student in the public universities and two-year colleges in Alabama?
Yes, so different colleges will take them, like I said, they will classify them differently. It's according to whatever, I guess, criteria they use to classify them. But I have heard of a few of them being classified as international students, which is a huge burden because they'll get charged like triple the tuition money. And we have had to like go back and forth with, like, they'll usually come to me and they'll ask like, why do you know why I was classified this way? And of course I don't know, so I have to call the university. And then I think I've seen that case like 3 times, and 2 out of those 3 times we have been able to get them reclassified, at least out of state or something, or in state if possible. Usually they'll ask, they just like, and like I said, it varies from university to university, but they usually want like more proof that they have been here for however much period of time. But yeah, I definitely have seen that where they will be classified as international students.
Okay, thank you. The next question is for you again, Diana. Is the CSS profile for non-DACA students?
Yes, so that would be, even if you've got DACA, that's just an alternative. Even if you have DACA and you don't want, which I mean the government already has your information, but that's just a tool that Birmingham Southern College has started using to, you know, avoid, because a lot of people do have that nervousness of sharing that information, especially if you don't have DACA. So I would say it is especially for those that do not have DACA, but anybody could use them if they want an alternative to FAFSA.
So,
And just to add a little bit to that, universities all over the country will use CSS as an alternative to FAFSA. So that applies to a whole host of students and not any particular population of students. But yeah, it's definitely a great alternative for those students who are unable to complete the FAFSA.
great. There's another question from uleadnet.org. The following Alabama institutions have granted DACA recipients enrollment rights and in-state tuition: the University of Alabama in Huntsville, Birmingham and Tuscaloosa, Troy University in Dothan and Troy, University of Montevallo, Auburn University at Montgomery and Auburn, Alabama Community College System. So the question is, do you know if that information is still accurate?
Yeah, so I don't know how accurate it is. Like I said, from my experience just assisting students in the community, and because I am based out of Birmingham, a lot of those students are coming to me from UAB. What they're experiencing is some of them will get charged in state and some of them will get charged out of state. Usually when we've tried to dig further as to why they're being charged out of state and why some are and some aren't, it seems to be some kind of like misunderstanding at the office, and usually they just want more proof that the student has, you know, resided here in the state for however much, you know, however long period of time, and then they'll reclassify them. So it sounds pretty accurate, but I know students are still encountering some issues around that.
All right, thank you. Those are the 3 questions I had for you.
Great.
If anyone else wants to ask any questions, you can type it into the chat or Q&A.
Thank you so much, Manisha. We'll proceed on. So we have some next steps for you all. One thing that we're putting together is we kind of wanted a blog post available to you so that you could have a bunch of different links for resources that will be helpful when you're either assisting a student in this situation or if you are in this situation yourself. But we're posting a blog post that you can find on alabamapossible.org/blog. we're going to have a bunch of different FAFSA resources that are in Spanish. We'll also have some web pages covering financial aid eligibility in great detail. And then we're also linking you to some scholarship resource hubs. So like Katie touched on, there are plenty of scholarship opportunities that don't ask anything about citizenship status. So those are great resources that you can access on our blog. And as a reminder, we will post a recording of this webinar to our YouTube page, which you can find at youtube.com/Alabama Possible. We'll do that as soon as we can. And we typically also send out an email to everyone who's registered, linking you to all of these resources so that you don't have to search for it. You can just click the links directly in the email. But I want to thank everyone so much for joining our webinar today. Thank you so much to our partners, the Utah Higher Education Assistance Authority and HECA. We really appreciate your time. If you have any questions for us, feel free to reach out to Alabama Possible. We're more than happy to help, and we're also happy to connect you to more resources you might need.